I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. Derek Kahn is here he is the Executive Associate Director at the Office of Management and Budget. He has a long history of working in the transportation industry and in policy. He was most recently Undersecretary of Transportation for Policy at the Department of Transportation, which he held almost for 2 years. He's also been the member of the board of directors at Amtrak. He was a general manager at Lyft, and then he had several other private sector experiences before that. Derek also worked in the Bush White House, where I knew him. He got his MBA at Stanford, GSB, where he was an R.J. Miller Scholar. I can tell you, I was co-teaching a class when I was getting my PhD at Stanford about more than 2 decades ago. And the R.J. Miller Scholars are the top 10% of the class. And I can tell you that I wish everybody was in that top 10%. Of course, mathematically that's not possible, but they were the best students. You get that award for the highest GPA in the class, and it was really a joy to teach them. He also has a degree in economics from LSE, and he graduated from USC. So without further ado, here is Derek Kahn to talk about autonomous vehicles and the topics of this conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Karok, and thank you all for being here. Nothing like a post-lunch fascinating conversation. So hopefully the blood is flowing from your brain to your stomach, and we'll see who stays awake in 45 minutes. So I wanted to thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to be here at Brookings. There's a lot of familiar faces in the room. You had a great presentation this morning from Ken Leonard, who leads a lot of the work at DOT. And the afternoon is much more exciting. I wish I could stay because the next panel is fascinating with some of the foremost experts around P3s. You have Rick Geddes, who literally is the nation's top experts in public-private partnerships. Marjorie Blumenthal has perhaps the best, most comprehensive analysis she wrote at RAND on a safety framework. And Cliff Winston has this really creative, fascinating paper on why traffic deaths drop during recessions. And it's really, in short, a self-selection process is sort of what he predicts, but just a great set of panels. And at the end of the day, you have Tanya Snyder chairing a panel, and Tanya's great. She's a reporter at Politico. She always asks very insightful and provocative questions. I'm thankful she's not going to be able to ask me any, I hope. So I wanted to do a few things this morning. This afternoon, I wanted to share some broad observations on mobility and broad trends. Then I wanted to talk about broad observations around autonomous vehicles, what the federal government is doing for mobility and AVs, and end with just a lightning round of big questions that folks are asking and my short answers. In terms of broad observations on mobility and autonomous vehicle, we see a mega trend around mass urbanization. Data shows that about 55% of the world currently lives in major metropolitan cities. By 2050, that's expected to grow to 66%. Consequently, urban congestion will be the greatest challenge for the next generation. And you not only see mass urbanization growing, but also the concept of mobility and the concept of the car is changing. One of the mega trends around the car is they expect cars of the future to be 3 things: shared, connected, and electrified. And I think there's jury's still out on some of these, but shared, certainly the case. Connected, a lot of the panelists this morning talked about the importance of connected vehicles, and it seems like there are demonstrated safety benefits. And electric, I think that one has some open discussion and sort of open debate if we see that. We're also seeing with mobility a much greater understanding and insight into travel patterns like we've never seen before. If you look at how people travel, most recent data from the Federal Highway shows that people travel patterns follow a Poisson distribution. 70% of the trips you take are 10 miles or less. And once upon a time, you had 3 modes of transportation: mass transit, car, or train. Well, then the airplane came along, and that sort of was the 3 or 4 main travel modalities. However, today you have e-bikes, you have scooters, and what you're seeing is for these 70% of trips, there's going to be a whole set of options that you've never seen before. And on top of that, with companies like Uber, Lyft, and Didi, and all of these ride-sharing companies, we now have an app that can help us make the trade-off between time, distance, and price, which is something we've never had before. And as a result, the way we travel is changing rapidly. Also, people tend to think that transportation will move slowly and evolve slowly. That's not completely true if you look at history. In 1900, there were about 8,000 cars in the United States. 20 years later, in 1920, there were 8 million cars in the United States, a 1,000-fold increase. And from 8 million cars in 1920, today you have about 270 million cars. And so the first 20 years of a new technology, you see radical transformation. And today we have more cars than we do adults over the age of 18. Part of this fascinating expansion in the early 1900s was the creation of the car dealership. And I'll touch on that briefly, but from 1900 to 1920, tens of thousands of car dealerships grew across the country. And as we start thinking about the autonomous vehicle, there's a core policy question of this important constituency, car dealerships, what will be the future of them? We're also seeing new business models that didn't exist a year ago, from ride-sharing, scooters, to e-bikes. And as we think about new business models, dealerships are going to play an important role. Two other sort of macro trends here. There's significant regional variation as you look at automobiles generally. Detroit, when it was first conceived, was the perfect mix of talent and supply chain. It was where a lot of railroads crossed it, so it was easy to get auto parts into that region. And suddenly you had automakers, parts suppliers, transportation hubs, what we in Silicon Valley called the ecosystem. You had a perfect ecosystem to distribute this innovative technology at the turn of the 20th century. However, in the last few years, we've started to see a massive shift away from Detroit to the south in states like Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And so today, Alabama is one of the largest manufacturers of autos because of things like tax incentives, a robust ecosystem of talented suppliers, and close proximity to a supply chain, namely ports and transportation hubs. And so this raises an important question, I think, for policymakers, for researchers. Where will the first 10,000 autonomous vehicles be produced in this country? Or maybe around the world? In what country will you see the first 10,000 vehicles? And in what state will you see these first vehicles? Will it be in Silicon Valley, where technologists, computer scientists, and sensor experts live? Or will it be in a manufacturing hub, where low cost of labor, auto parts manufacturers persist? Finally, one broad observation, global competitiveness. Right now, the United States has perhaps the greatest capacity for innovation. And I think what we're going to see in the next 10 years is which country will lead around autonomous vehicles. Right now, there are really three broad models in terms of national regulation. You have the Chinese model, which is a very unitary, centrally planned model, where they have, for the next 15 years, layout of what milestones they hope to hit in terms of cars produced, tech milestones. They literally have a national product roadmap for the introduction of the electric vehicle and the autonomous vehicle. You have Europe that has a council. In Germany, they have a council, and I think it's called the Golden Council, that together, this council made up of stakeholders of unions, of car manufacturers, together set policy. And then you have the United States, which is very open. We have federal voluntary policy, some state policy, but for the most part, a very open, let a thousand flower blooms approach and see what emerges. The fascinating thing is going to be over the next decade, which of these three models will emerge. And I have a point of view that I'll share at the end, but it's an important question as we as policymakers think, what does the competitive landscape of this look like? Some broad observations on autonomous vehicles. Every 5-10 years, people have a look forward of what AVs will look like. And I think people love predicting the future of AVs and have we hit the milestones. In short, we've gotten some things right, some things wrong, and a lot of things we don't know. What did we get right? We knew that the technology would be very difficult. We knew that partnerships between OEMs and technology would be important. And we had some interesting theoretical observations very early on in the process. For instance, the introduction of automation and AI taught us that autonomous vehicles actually do something very different with the concept of risk. And Kroc has a great paper called Driverless Cars on the concept of risk. autonomous vehicles didn't diffuse risk, it actually centralized risk. It centralized risk with the engineers. And so instead of those of us in this room potentially getting a car accident, what we did is we resulted in a single computer engineer potentially putting into a line of code a major incident that everybody in the room would suffer if their car was in a similar situation. And so that was an early observation that theorists had, and it's helpful in some ways and something we need to be mindful of as we move forward. I think some other things we got right, two more. One is partnerships are key. The Department of Transportation recently put out autonomous vehicle demonstration grants, and if you look at these grants, they're designed to have people apply as partners. And we're realizing that no single entity, no city, no OEM, no technology company can do the entire stack. Rather, you need a partnership that manages hardware, software, customer, all of these things together is going to enable the autonomous vehicle to come to market. And finally, we also got right, I think, that the city, state, and federal roles will be very different. And I think for the most part, these are largely agreed upon. They're not settled matters, but they're largely agreed upon. The federal government's role is to oversee the engineering and the design of the vehicle. The state's responsibility is around the operation of the vehicle, so speed limits, things like what is considered safe and unsafe behavior, and insurance, which has largely been delegated to states throughout our nation's history. We got a lot of things wrong, though, too, at the same time. We got wrong things like timing. We assumed that products would come to market much faster. Every 5 years, a forecast says in 4 years this will happen. We've actually seen it with all the OEMs. And literally every prediction of when cars will be on the road have been missed. 10 years ago, we thought there'd be thousands of autonomous vehicles deployed in the country today. That certainly hasn't been the case. Today, there are 1,400 vehicles all being tested in the United States, but none that are being sold for commercial purposes. Number two, what we got wrong were metrics to evaluate success. And I hope this afternoon the people in this room can really help us with this question. It's a very complicated policy question, but if you recall, when autonomous vehicles first hit the road, there were two main metrics people loved talking about. Maybe three, but two main ones. Number one, vehicle miles tested. Who's tested the most miles? Who's hit 1 billion miles? Who's hit 2 billion miles? Who's hit the most miles tested? Number two was disengagements. How often did a safety driver have to take over the car? Disengagements, miles tested were the two metrics that some states asked autonomous vehicles to report on. Now, we've learned over the last few years that both these metrics, while helpful to advance the dialogue, create major principal agent problems. Vehicle miles tested is a very, very blunt test. Think about it. If you drive 50,000 miles across the coast in between, that's a very different test scenario than 50,000 miles inside a major metropolitan area. In some parts of the country, you could drive 1,000 miles without seeing another person, another car. And so this whole concept of vehicle miles tested, we sort of look back and said, like, yeah, that probably wasn't the best metric to lead off on. The second also created major challenges and took us a little bit for a curveball. That was disengagements. All cars today have, or vast majority of cars today have a safety driver. So if you're driving in a vehicle and there's a problem, safety driver takes over, takes control of the vehicle. Some states, City of California, City of San Francisco, State of California, I believe, wanted people to report on the number of disengagements. Well, the problem with disengagements is it's a gameable metric. And this is one of the points that Margie puts out in the RAND paper that you'll probably hear about in the next panel. But if you can game a metric, if you could game a safety metric, it's not a very good metric. And so as policymakers, it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about. What are reasonable metrics, non-gameable metrics? And we actually see it. It's not simply an autonomous vehicle problem. It's a problem that exists throughout all transportation. For instance, dangerous driving. We know the consequence of dangerous driving has a clear red line, which is a fatal car accident. But precedent to that, what are other examples of dangerous driving we have proxies for, but if it doesn't lead to a fatal accident, was that really dangerous or not? And so you get into these challenges of what are good proxies for safety knowing the outer bounds of safety are accidents, and the outer bound are fatal car accidents. So one of the things we got wrong very early on were metrics to evaluate success. And it's not anything wrong, I mean, in the evolution of policy. It's where you'd expect us to be. I think one other thing that we are moving away from are the SAE 5 levels framework. We talk a lot about level 3, 4, and 5, and we've realized that level 3 is an important, it's a useful framework for the starting point, but level 3 is a very broad bucket with a lot of examples, and we're starting to figure out how do we parse level 3 SAE testing. What we still don't know, I think there are two big things we still don't know. One, what are the metrics we use to evaluate success? And this is so important. I truly hope that the people in this room can help us think about this question and think through what should the metrics be that the federal government uses, that the state government uses to measure success. And number two, what is the sensor stack? That's a technology problem, but a very serious one. There really are two big heuristics that exist in this day and age. One is the autonomous vehicle replicates two core human functions, core human cognitive functions, the ability to see and the ability to think. And the theory goes, if the ability to see is what the autonomous vehicle is trying to replicate, then all we need are cars. We don't have internal radar. We don't have internal sonar. We just have two eyes in which we can see. And so the concept is, let's have only cameras, not LiDAR, and not radar, and not all these other things, simply a camera. The other sort of end of the spectrum is all of these things are important. We actually do have depth perception, which is radar. We do have the ability to see how fast things are moving, which is LiDAR. And so to replicate the eye, you can't simply use cameras. You need a comprehensive sensor stack of LiDAR, radar, cameras. This is an important business decision because it really gets to who is going to win in the hardware space and starts getting to regulation and policy. To what extent should policymakers say this is what your technology stack needs to look like? We still don't know what the stack looks like. We don't know how to measure that sensor stack, and we really don't know yet how safe is safe enough. Our hope is that where we are as a nation, though, is at a good place, and I think it is. We currently have 1,400 vehicles in the United States being tested by, I think, over 70-some different companies, and I think Ken Leonard in the back has all of the numbers, chapter and verse. And in California alone, we have 1,200 vehicles being tested. I want to spend last few minutes talking about policy broadly, what the administration's doing, and conclude with a lightning round of major open questions. The administration has laid down broad principles on autonomous vehicles, and it touches and builds upon the earlier part of my talk. Number one, prioritize safety. No matter how exciting this is, no matter how many lives we can save, no matter how many people in this room can sleep in the back seat of an autonomous vehicle like they are right now, you know, it can satisfy, safety must come first. Number two, tech neutral. Federal government, nor any government, in our opinion, should be saying that this is the ideal technology stack. So we call that tech neutral. We don't know if one form of LiDAR, a solid-state LiDAR, is better than a non-solid-state LiDAR. We don't know if a LiDAR is better than a radar. Rather, what we want to move toward is a performance-based policy or performance-based regulation versus something on the front end where we lay out specific, detailed approaches in terms of the inputs. So prioritize safety, tech neutral. We also are not top-down command and control, but rather our approach has been to modernize regulations. If you look at regulations, particularly the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, there's four different chapters. The second chapter of FMVSS is called crash worthiness standards. The 200s are generally crash worthiness standards. In the case of an automobile accident, what are the internal components and design standards of a car that reduces the impact and ensures the safety of the people inside the car? Well, as policymakers, an interesting policy question came before us when I was at DOT. what if this car is designed to never have a person? What if it will never, ever transport a human being, not as a driver, not as a passenger? Do we need to put in airbags, windshield wipers, mirrors? Well, there's one company in this country designing self-driving package delivery vehicle that says FMVSS, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, requires these things, so we have a seatbelt in it. We have an airbag in our prototype. And I sit and think, like, where's your airbag place? Like, who are you protecting? And so this is a perfect example of how we need, as a federal government, to modernize our regulations. At DOT, we've looked at all the activities around autonomous vehicles in 3 big buckets: regulations, research, and public awareness. On the regulations front, we've streamlined the exemption process, how you can apply to produce more autonomous vehicles for sale. We've begun to update and modernize standards around federal motor vehicle safety standards. And what that means is systematically going through every rule we have to better understand, is it applicable for an era in the concept of things like package delivery. And some are easy. Some are very easy up front. For instance, does the steering wheel need to be designed a certain way in terms of the radius of the steering wheel if you don't have anybody behind it? And so that's one clear example where we probably don't need things like a steering wheel and brake pads. But then there are other parts of the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards that raise other questions, such as in case of crash avoidance, how prescriptive should the federal government be in laying down specific engineering rules as to how self-driving cars can avoid accidents? So the streamlining the exemption process is easy. Modernizing standards and FMVSS is a little hard. Some are easy, some are hard. 2 other fronts we're spending a lot of time on is on research. This administration has put out 2 autonomous vehicle voluntary guidance. Secretary Chow, when she came into office, was very eager to make sure that the federal government would not be an impediment to the adoption of autonomous vehicles, but rather that would be left to the public sector, to the public, and that the only real constraint of adoption should be a willingness of the people in this room to get in the back of it. We did not want the federal government to be the constraint here. Also on research, we've done things like incorporated new technologies into our discretionary grants, and we've even begun to do things like develop crash dummies for rear-facing seats and researching alternative occupant protection systems. So that's regulations, that's research. The final one we've spent a lot of time doing is on public awareness. Campaigns like this, conferences like this are great because the policy questions are complicated. And so we've done a number of listening sessions and a number of events around the country highlighting good research, innovation, and also the policy questions that exist. And so at a high level, what DOT has done in the 2.5 years under Secretary Chow and President Trump is transformed itself as an organization. For better part of 50 years, we were focused on existing transportation modes. However, we've moved from basic existing transportation sources to new technologies. And it's been a cultural change like you've never seen. That as we look at everything from discretionary grants to activities around the country, we'll ask ourselves, how do we imbue and embed technology into this? And it's a long road, but the department is well positioned to embrace this. We also see this shift and this embrace of technology on the Hill. Last year, Congress appropriated $100 million for autonomous vehicle demonstration grants. And right now there's talk of should we enact an AV START bill, which deals with federal preemption and allocation of liability in this space. I want to end in our last few minutes with a few big questions and sort of lightning round and conclude. I see 6 big questions that folks like asking about. Number 1, where does regulation go from here? I expect regulation to have a lot of stops and starts. I expect federal government to put out more RFIs, maybe even a proposed rule, get a lot of comments back, and we'll stop and analyze it for a while. I expect states to do the same. I expect some states to go out very quick, Something happens and they pull back. We see that in Phoenix right now. Number two, when will AVs launch? Question everybody always has. Hard to say, but my guess is much longer than people think. A lot of people are predicting in the next few years. My personal sense is it's going to be a few years, 5 years or longer before we see autonomous vehicles commercially viable for the broad public. Number three, what will the role of infrastructure be? And I know that's a key part of today's conversation. My sense is infrastructure is one of many variables in determining what region wins, what country wins. And what I mean by that is infrastructure, V2V, V2I technology is potentially important, but not all car companies believe it's a prerequisite to success. Rather, it's going to be one of many variables, such as state and local laws, such as the ecosystem I talked about earlier, customer acceptance and public perception, and how you will have fixed and zoned routes. So infrastructure will be important, but I don't think it will be the driving exogenous factor. Number four, how will liability be sorted out? And I think it's an important question. We're starting to see the development of insurance products for ride-sharing companies. I expect the same to happen with autonomous vehicles. And so how will liability be sorted out? I think through the market and through the creation of new products, and then finally through the courts. There's no clear federal role for insurance as it's generally regulated at the state level. So I see states starting to think about how they assign liability. And right now the model people frequently point to is the aviation model. How will locals respond, and what will it look like around the country? I think there will be a patchwork for a long period of time with local governments learning from each other. And you're starting to see that now with ride sharing, and right now you're seeing with scooters. Some cities are very, very much embracing scooters. Others are setting quotas on scooters. Others are setting licenses. And so we see cities having a very different approach, and then evolving into cities teaching each other what they've learned. And we're seeing it now with airports. For anybody that travels to an airport in a ride-sharing car, you're now taxed often at the airport, and that airport revenue is used to make up for parking loss revenue. And this was not sort of a centrally planned thing. Just a few airports had this creative insight, inelastic demand of going to an airport in a ride share. $2 isn't going to make or break it. And so you're starting to see cities across, municipal airports across the country embrace this. I expect the same with autonomous vehicles, that there's also a major, massive business opportunity here. Helping cities develop the platform and tools to manage new mobility options is going to be something major and something significant that you will see one day there to be the Google platform of all mobility options in cities. And finally, who will win globally? My sense is Asia will likely win in the near term. That over the next 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to see China just start producing more and more autonomous vehicles. But I believe in the long term, the United States will win, just because there are parts of the technology stack that are probably incorrect that we're not even thinking about today. Just like the cell phone, when the cell phone first came out, and which was about 11 and a half years ago, the camera being a part of it was strange. Why do we need a camera in our pocket all the time? But now, as we go out, I'm going to be taking a selfie with all of you, so clearly it's just such a critical element of our life. I want to just conclude by saying this is an exciting time, and this is just a time in which there is so much hope and excitement around autonomous vehicles, and there are so many eyeballs on this new technology. And the excitement and the hype in AVs is shared by the administration, by the department. But underneath all of this excitement, there's a huge body of work being done. There's coding done by computer scientists. There's the muscle of automotive engineers putting components onto cars. There's hardware engineers thinking of what the next graphics processing unit should look like, the grit of infrastructure builders, and the insight of policymakers. And I think half this room is made up of policymakers, and this is where a lot of the hard work will be done. Believe it or not, the papers you put together, the paper that Rand put together, was such an important piece of work. The driverless cars piece that Karoq wrote in December, so helpful in shaping the views of policymakers. So for those of you in this room that are sitting here listening and thinking about how AVs play out, I welcome and encourage you to keep being part of the dialogue, because it's through the notice and comment, through the request for information, that you inform policymakers about what AV 4.0 should look like, what the next set of AV rules should look like. And so that help is so important to all that we do. I spend a lot of time today predicting and sort of sharing a forecast of what the future's like. In the words of Yogi Berra, prediction is hard, especially about the future. So take it for what it's worth. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here, for being part of this great conversation, and I'll open up for Q&A.
Thank you for your comments. It's very helpful. I know you had said earlier that you felt that infrastructure is not going to be the driver for AVs, but I think it's safe to assume that most AVs are going to be EVs. And so with that, given that there is money in the public space, particularly through states, to spend money on EV infrastructure, and I know that there has been some hesitation on spending some of that money because states are very concerned about, I want to spend this money smart. I don't want to spend it for something that's good for 3 years. I want to think about the next 5, 10, or 20 years with respect to how to spend this money. And on top of that, we know that Senator Carper has proposed a highway corridor bill, which could introduce additional monies, particularly along the highway corridor, to support this. So with that in mind, the highway corridor bill, VW settlement, a lot of this money is in state hands. What should they be thinking about today to spend that money wisely and be able to enable technology that we want to see in the near future?
It's a question was, how should cities and states think about all of this money that we're seeing in infrastructure from the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill? Earlier this week, Senator Carper, Senator Barrasso, chairman of and ranking member of the Environmental Public Works, released a bill. The bill was about $297 billion over 5 years in increased infrastructure spending. I don't think infrastructure is going to be an enabler, but I do think infrastructure has the potential to be a blocker. If you look online, you'll find a lot of pictures of situations where self-driving cars are unable to drive in because the infrastructure just doesn't make sense. So while the right infrastructure will not bring AVs to your cities or states, the wrong infrastructure will deter you. So I do think that you're going to see from the Department of Transportation, from Congress, an expansion of how surface transportation programs operate. And just in general, the way surface transportation programs operate, is they are federally funded, state administered. And so the federal government takes the money from the gas tax, gives it to states, and there is a broad set of eligibilities that state can use this money on. States are seeing increased eligibility for things like technology and electric vehicles. That was passed in the last Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill called the FAST Act. Also, there's a number of discretionary grants that the federal government has, and we've incorporated technology into it. So the way I would think about it as cities and states is this Department of Transportation, this administration, is very eager and open to new technologies and innovation. And so if you look at the discretionary grants that DOT put out, technology was an important element. So what I would encourage cities and states to do is to think through, how can you infuse AVs, new technologies, innovation, EVs into the thinking of applying for state and federal funds, because it's definitely something that federal government looks at, and it's something that is an increased eligibility. What will be interesting over the next 6 months is not only did we expand eligibility, but are you going to see a shift in criteria where there's actually emphasis placed upon EV infrastructure or AVs? My general sense is part of our tech neutrality is, while industry seems to be pursuing electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, this administration does not take that as a given. And so if there's going to be an AV with a combustion engine, we're not going to say that doesn't make sense. Rather, we are tech neutral, particularly as it pertains to EVs and combustion engine.
Thank you very much. My question is that the automobile vehicles cost to everyday life for everyday citizens. I'm not sure that anybody mentioned about that subject. Particularly, I'm concerned, like automated street. You have to pay 1 mile how much? if probably it won't happen too soon, but if it happened in everywhere, I wonder that maybe somebody has to think about it. Something like a food stamp, something like a road stamp for low-income people.
Question was, how do we think about AVs to specific populations like low income and populations that have that have greater needs? Well, I could share with you, the Department of Transportation was given $100 million, and it's actually presented a very complicated policy question. In a space where there's billions of dollars, federal government gave us $100 million to allocate it. Well, there literally is billions of dollars from venture capitalists to OEMs. So the way we looked at this pot of money is, where is there a lack of investment? Where is there a market failure in the sense of not enough research going into a particular area? The specific area in which we invested in were in populations with the elderly and the disabled. And we thought that most AV companies are not going to go out and think, how do we serve low-income populations or populations with people with disabilities. Rather, we as a federal government, as an administration, said this is probably going to be an area where you don't see a ton of fruitful research. And so we designed a lot of our research agenda around this particular question: how will AVs serve this population? And on this front, and this is sort of going back to my experience before government, the amazing thing about ride-sharing companies and autonomous vehicle technology is it is a great tool for certain populations, such as the elderly, such as those that are in need, as the questioner asked, because we can deliver transportation to your phone and tell you, please go outside right now to catch a self-driving car that's going to come and find you. And so what you see is this technology has so much potential to really transform the lives of people. It's just, are we going to have enough investment and focus on it? We as a government, as an administration, are trying to answer this exact question and make sure there is enough research done to what everything from the human design of the car should look like to how will we ensure that all populations will have access to these vehicles.
So one of the things that you brought up was the importance of states and localities. And following on the prior question, if you are blind or unable to drive, you literally can't sit in the driver's seat, even if it's a self-driving car. The Uniform Laws Commission did just complete, after 2 years, a model for states to overcome these types of legacy problems. To what extent do you see the administration's ability to help normalize state laws across the country with respect to enabling access and mobility?
Great question. What is the federal government doing to help mobilize state patchwork of laws around mobility, particularly for specific populations? We try to find, this administration's philosophy is we want to find that right balance from identifying good practices without being heavy-handed and telling all states to do something, particularly when it's not entirely clear to us that there is a federal role as set in the Constitution. And so if you look at AV 3.0, the guidance Secretary Chow put out last September of 2018, we actually lay out model or best practices at the state level. And in that section, we talk about specific populations. And I expect at some point in time over the next 2 years, we'll update that and say, here are what we're seeing among states. And here are the best practices, some of the best legislation we're seeing in states. And we recommend that other states start thinking about these things. And so what we've done is we've tried to pull up at the federal level all the things states are doing and put together resources that we can then distribute to other state legislators. Our view is not to be command and control, in large part because populations in every city and state are different. So it's somewhat presumptuous for us to believe that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, particularly when it comes to particular populations, because that's not just population, but it's also what does the city look like, how's the city designed, and these are things we clearly recognize is authorities delegated to the states. However, we believe there's an important federal role in identifying the best practices, model legislation or best practice legislation, and then circulating that and sharing that with state DOT heads and state governors. Yes.
So there's no legislative framework for autonomous vehicles. There are no federal regulatory requirements. It's all voluntary. And Tesla is saying that they're going to have released kind of a software update within this year to have fully self-driving cars. Already they have autopilot on the highways. They're saying that they're going to have the capability to do the same in urban areas. That's making a lot of people very anxious, but is there, what is the federal government's ability or interest in setting some guardrails around that?
Great question. The question was, there are no federal laws or regulations around this. What is the federal government's role going to be when companies claim or pronounce they're going to put cars on the road soon? So the first part of your question is actually somewhat of a misconception. The federal government does have tremendous authorities. We have something called defect authority, and we have the ability to direct automakers to cease and desist. So defect authority is a very powerful authority that NHTSA has. If there's a component of a car that is defective, we could pull cars off the road. And our interpretation of our defect authority is that this applies to the algorithm, the AI, the brains of autonomous vehicle. And we describe this in AV 3.0 in our voluntary guidance, that we have all of the authorities we need, that if we see bad actors, if we see cars not doing what they're programmed or what they're marketed to do, we will take those cars off the road. And in fact, we have. In Florida, there was one AV shuttle provider that had claimed they were testing this AV shuttle. Well, it came to the department's attention that they were transporting children to and from school or around the city. And so in our mind, that is clearly not testing, that's actually deployment of technology. And so we order them to stop all testing. And so the concept that we aren't doing anything is a bit of a misnomer, but we actually are monitoring vigorously what is happening across the country. And NHTSA's defect authority is an extremely powerful authority where we could take any set of cars off the road. The hard part is this, as policymakers, is when there are cases in which it's a combination of poor user error and poor design, and it's not entirely clear where the problem is. And that's oftentimes where the gray area becomes. Should we more aggressively use defect authority or not? And so Tesla is going to be one example where we are going to be tracking the deployment of Teslas very closely and seeing how that plays out. But there are federal laws. There's a federal law that has been on the books for decades that empowers NHTSA to identify any defects and take cars off the road. I saw one last question, and then maybe we'll turn over to the next panel.
Thank you. You said that autonomous vehicles replicate our ability to see and think. And I would argue that they also will hear and remember. So hear and remember. And so I think that in the priorities that you listed, I didn't hear data privacy and security issues as one of them. And I understand that there are a lot of people currently claiming jurisdiction over those issues. And it is not necessarily a place where DOT has had to tread. But at what point do you see DOT needing to engage with data privacy and security issues when you're engaging with this new technology? I realize I'm asking for another prediction, but.
Yeah. Question was, how does DOT think about data privacy? Because one of the components of what cars do is not only see and think, but also hear and remember. And that's absolutely true. The reason self-driving cars are getting better is because they have an algorithm that learns from the past, similar to how we drive. The role of data privacy is a very open question, which has tons of different views. I have a personal view and sense of where things are going, but it's very unformed because there are two major issues here. One is there's not a clear legal authority for DOT to acquire, regulate, track, mandate any type of data standard. And that presents a complexity here. There are pieces of law we can interpret, such as different types of authorities we can interpret broadly, but there's not been any clear direction from Congress what the desire is for DOT to do or any federal agency to do around data privacy. However, there's a very good model out there. It's called the ASIAS model, ASIAS. It's a great model people should look. After, I forget if it was 93 or 94, there was a summer in which there were a number of significant passenger plane accidents in this country. ValueJet was one of them in the Everglades. New York had a second one. And what air carriers did is they came together and said, you know what, we should figure out a way to share information in a way that we don't trip any anti-competitive laws, we protect our trade secrets, and we don't get into trouble with these things. And so they created a system called ASIAS, where twice a year for, I think, 2 days, the top operators from air carriers share data. I was landing at JFK, and my warning indicator started beeping. I don't know why. Another person in the room says the same thing happened to me. And suddenly, through pattern recognition, different air carriers with different pilots start pattern recognizing and understanding some of the problems they ran into. This is not, there's no congressional mandate, there's no legal requirement to do this. But what Congress did do is it passed an indemnity provision that said if you share data for public good or public safety for this specific program, you're indemnified from prosecution, provided it wasn't intentional, and provided you report within 24 hours. So there's basically a voluntary data sharing organization that came about. And I think this is going to be one of the important ways that this is addressed, that as AV automakers start coming together and sharing data, that'll address some of it, but it doesn't address the other side of that coin, which is personal data. And that's one that there are tons of different views. My personal prediction for this, again, channeling Yogi Berra, take it for what it's worth, is I think you will see Europe much more aggressively thinking about this than the United States. With GDPR, you're already seeing questions around data, around what tech firms are tracking. And so what that tells me is you're going to see other countries move faster on this data privacy piece, I think, than we are, simply because that's an issue that they think a lot about. Whereas here it's unclear, is this a state issue? Is it a federal issue? Where would we derive our legal authority from? And what are the mandates that we'd put on them? So what I see in this country, at least there have been two moderate attempts to create a voluntary data exchange. The problem with that is when you have companies that are at very different life stages, pure startup to companies that have invested $50 billion, there is no desire to share data. And so what we're seeing with some of the research that some of the panelists you're going to talk to next is what should they even be tracking? And my hope is before we get into even privacy, we begin to just align on what is the specific safety standards we want data to report on. And let's start sharing those things before we start getting into the very sticky wicket of insurance, of data privacy and data sharing. So with that, I very much appreciate Karok and Brookings for hosting this fascinating discussion. I hope you all stick around for the next two panels and really appreciate your engagement on this issue. It's really active citizens, engineers, policymakers that together are going to help shape this technology that our kids will look back at and say it transformed the world. So thank you very much. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.